This is the story of the beach Canada took on D-Day, and of how the most successful landing of June 6, 1944 became the one that history remembers least. On a 6-mile stretch of Normandy coast codenamed Juno, roughly 14,000 Canadians went ashore into the second heaviest resistance of the entire invasion, and by nightfall they stood deeper inside occupied France than any other Allied force on the continent. That last claim is the paradox this whole story turns on. Of the 5 invasion beaches that morning, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, only one was handed to a nation that was neither the United States nor Britain. That beach was Juno, and the nation was Canada. The Canadians met the stiffest fire of any beach except Omaha. They lost landing craft to mined obstacles at a rate of close to 30%, and they still punched farther inland than the Americans at Omaha, farther than the British at Gold and Sword, farther than anyone. Picture where the day ended before we even begin it. By dusk on June 6, the forward elements of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division stood deeper into France than those of any other division in the invasion. The historian John Keegan, writing in 6 Armies in Normandy, put it plainly, observing that the opposition the Canadians faced was stronger than that of any other beach save Omaha, and that this was an accomplishment in which the whole nation could take considerable pride. And yet the memory went elsewhere. When the world pictures D-Day, it pictures Omaha, the slaughter in the surf, the bluffs, the bodies in the tide. It does not, as a rule, picture Courseulles-sur-Mer, or Bernier-sur-Mer, or Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. It does not picture the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada walking into a machine gun at point-blank range. The beach that achieved the most is the beach that gets remembered the least, and that inversion is no accident. By the end of this story you will understand exactly why, and the answer turns out to be stranger, and far more uncomfortable, than the word forgotten suggests. To understand Juno, start with the question almost nobody bothers to ask, which is why Canada got a beach at all. Canada in 1944 was not a small contributor borrowing a corner of someone else's war. Canada had declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939, as an independent nation, on its own timetable and by its own decision, and by the time the invasion was planned the country fielded the 3rd largest army, navy, and air force among the Western Allies. Roughly 1,159,000 Canadians served in the Second World War, drawn from a national population of only about 11 million people. That works out to somewhere near 9% of the entire country in uniform. One detail buried inside those numbers deserves to be pulled out and held up. The 1st Canadian Army was the only Allied army overseas composed entirely of volunteers. Conscripts existed in Canada, yet only a small number ever reached combat, and only at the very end of the war. The men who went to Juno had, almost to the last man, chosen to be there. For most of the war, those volunteers had been waiting. Canadian forces built up in Britain from 1940 onward and sat in a defensive role, guarding against an invasion that never came, and the historian Mark Milner has described the pressure that built up around those idle, trained, eager divisions. There was political feeling in both Ottawa and London, and there was popular feeling among the soldiers themselves, that Canadian troops needed action. They had trained for years. They had not yet fought. A second shadow hung over the decision, and it was a darker one. On August 19, 1942, Canada had already tried a landing in France, at the port of Dieppe, and the Dieppe raid is remembered, accurately, as Canada's single bloodiest day of the war. Out of an assault force of roughly 5,000 Canadians, 913 were killed and 1,946 were taken prisoner, and total Canadian casualties reached 3,367, all of it inside a matter of hours. Dieppe failed, but the planners of the invasion pulled lessons from that failure, learning the need for overwhelming fire support and the hard truth that you do not throw infantry directly at a fortified port. How directly those lessons fed the invasion plan is a point historians still argue over, and the Juno Beach Center itself notes that the connection between Dieppe and D-Day remains debated, with some scholars pointing instead to the Sicily landings of July 1943 as the more direct source of amphibious technique. The emotional logic, though, is impossible to deny. Canada had bled at Dieppe. Canada would be back, and this time Canada would land on a beach carrying its own name. The name itself arrives with a small mystery attached. The Commonwealth beaches were named, the story goes, after fish, goldfish, swordfish, and jellyfish, shortened to gold, sword, and jelly, and the popular version holds that Britain's wartime leadership rejected the name jelly as unfit for a beach where men were going to die, swapping it for something with more dignity, which produced Juno. That tidy tale has been challenged. Researchers have since argued that the name jelly was never actually under consideration at all, and that Juno was chosen for a far less romantic reason, sharing its initial letter with the naval task force responsible for landing the Canadians, Force J. You can present both versions, though the colorful one may well be the invented one, and this small example points at a much larger pattern you will see again and again, because the most satisfying version of a fact about Juno is very often not the verified one. Now the ground itself. Juno ran about 6 miles wide, roughly 9.5 kilometers, sitting between the British beach of Gold to the west and the British beach of Sword to the east, and that position was not incidental, it was the entire strategic point. A continuous Allied front depended on Juno stitching the two British beaches into one unbroken line, which meant that if Juno failed, the invasion front would carry a hole right through its middle. The Canadians split their beach into two main assault sectors. The western sector took the code name Mike, anchored on the fishing port of Courseulles-sur-Mer and the village of Grey-sur-Mer, while the eastern sector took the code name Nan, running through Bernier-sur-Mer and out to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Mike broke down further into red and white, Nan into green, white, and red. 3 small Norman seaside towns, Courseulles, Berniers, and Saint-Aubin, and on the morning of June the 6th every one of them had been turned into a fortress. The wall they faced belonged to what Germany called the Atlantic Wall, and the men holding this particular stretch of it were not, on paper, Germany's finest. Defense of Juno fell mainly to the 716th Static Infantry Division under Generalleutnant Wilhelm Richter, and specifically to its 736th Grenadier Regiment, stiffened by attached Eastern Battalion troops, conscripts pulled from occupied territories in the east. A static division meant exactly what the word implies, a formation built not to maneuver but to hold ground, made up of older men and very young ones, soldiers judged unsuitable for the mobile war in the east. The 716th's combat strength has been put at around 7,771 men across its whole front, supported on that broader front by roughly 500 machine guns, 50 mortars, and 90 guns of various calibers. Here is the thing about a static defense, and it reaches well beyond the beach. A static defender is not trying to win a battle of maneuver. A static defender is trying to make the cost of crossing a line unacceptably high, which makes it, in the coldest possible sense, an actuarial problem, the same calculation an insurer runs when it prices risk. The defender does not need to stop you everywhere, the defender only needs to make the expected cost of the first few minutes so steep that the assault breaks before it can build momentum. The German strongpoints at Juno had been priced, deliberately, to bankrupt the first wave, and in places they came terrifyingly close to doing it. Those strongpoints carried a name, Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, abbreviated to WN, and they were numbered, and 3 of them matter for this story. At Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer sat WN-27, built around a 50mm anti-tank gun in a concrete casemate. At Bernier-sur-Mer sat WN-28. At Courseulles, the central port, sat a cluster of strongpoints mounting an 88mm gun and 75mm guns in casemates with concrete walls roughly 4 feet thick. Field Marshal Rommel had insisted on that concrete, and his insistence would matter enormously in the hours to come. The sea added a danger of its own. Off the Juno coast lay what the planners believed were treacherous offshore reefs and shoals, rock that could ground a landing craft and tear the bottom out of it, and to clear those reefs safely the planners pushed the landing time later, onto a higher, rising tide. That single decision, made out of caution, made to protect the men, set off a chain of consequences that nobody fully anticipated. Stay on that decision for a moment, because it is the cleanest example in the entire operation of how one upstream assumption can ripple downstream into something nobody intended. Anyone who has worked inside a complex system, a supply chain, a software stack, an engineering project, knows the pattern. You make one assumption early, for a perfectly good reason, and that assumption quietly sets the parameters for every decision that follows it, and you can change nothing about your intentions and the system will still produce a failure, because the failure was baked into the first assumption. At Juno, the first assumption ran like this: the reefs are dangerous, so we land late, on a higher tide, and every consequence that came afterward flowed straight out of that one input. Because the Canadians landed late, on a rising tide, The German beach obstacles, the mine stakes and hedgehogs planted across the sand, were no longer dry and exposed, they were underwater, or about to be. The engineers whose job was to clear lanes through those obstacles could not see them and could not reach them in time, and the landing craft had to feel their way in among mines they could not avoid. The mines collected their toll, because out of 306 landing craft committed at Juno, roughly 90 were lost or damaged, close to 30% of them, many wrecked on obstacles the tide had hidden, the same tide that was supposed to carry the men safely over the reefs. And now the detail that tips the whole thing from tragedy toward something closer to dark farce. Those feared offshore reefs, the rock that justified the late landing, that submerged the obstacles, that helped wreck a third of the landing craft, were not entirely rock at all. Investigators later discovered that some of the dreaded shoals were in fact banks of seaweed that probably would have posed little problem to most landing craft. The men of Juno landed late, into a tidal death trap, partly to avoid a hazard that partly turned out to be kelp. The landing hour itself fell differently in the two sectors. In the Western Mike sector, the 7th Brigade's assault hour was 7:45, while in the Eastern Nan sector the 8th Brigade's was 7:55, and both ran later than the British beaches on either side. Britannica records the first assault wave landing at 7:55, 10 minutes past the planned hour and fully 3 hours after the optimum rising tide. The Canadians went in last, and they went in against a tide that had already turned against them. So who were these 14,000 men? Naming them matters, because the units of Juno were not anonymous, they were communities, raised from specific towns and regions across Canada, and on June the 6th those communities were about to absorb losses that would echo back home for generations. The whole effort belonged to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Rodney Keller, and riding in with the infantry came the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade under Brigadier R.A. Wyman, Sherman tanks, including the strange swimming variants we will come to in a moment. In the Western Mike sector, around Courcelles, came the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Harry Foster. Its assault battalions were the Royal Winnipeg Rifles under Lieutenant Colonel Meldram, the Regina Rifle Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Foster Matheson, and the 1st Battalion of the Canadian Scottish Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Cabeldu. In the Eastern Nan sector, around Berniers and St. Aubin, came the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Kenneth Blackadder, and its assault battalions were the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada under Lieutenant Colonel Spraggy, the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Buell, and in reserve, Le Regiment de la Chaudière under Lieutenant Colonel Mathieu, the only French-Canadian assault unit on the beach. Held back to land later in the morning was the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Ben Cunningham, made up of the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, the Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders, and the North Nova Scotia Highlanders under Lieutenant Colonel Petch. Hold the North Nova Scotia Highlanders in your mind, because that regiment, and the men Petch led, will return in the worst part of this story. The armor came from 3 regiments of the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, the 1st Hussars under Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell supporting the 7th Brigade, the Fort Garry Horse under Lieutenant Colonel Morton supporting the 8th, and the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Gordon supporting the 9th. The artillery, under Brigadier Todd of the Royal Canadian Artillery, included field regiments firing self-propelled priest guns from the decks of their landing craft on the run-in, guns shooting from a pitching steel platform at a coast they were still approaching. Above the infantry and the armor sat 2 services that rarely earn a sentence in the Juno story, and both of them deserve more. The naval task force responsible for the Canadians was Force J, commanded by the Royal Navy's Commodore Geoffrey Oliver from the headquarters ship HMS Hillary, yet the Royal Canadian Navy's contribution to the overall operation ran enormous, roughly 110 ships and around 10,000 Canadian sailors. 2 Canadian destroyers, HMCS Algonquin and HMCS Sioux, fired in support off Juno, while 2 armed merchant cruisers, HMCS Prince Henry and HMCS Prince David, carried Canadian assault troops and their landing craft across the channel. One of those Canadian ships pulled off something worth pausing on. HMCS Algonquin drew a German battery as its target, and the destroyer's gunnery proved lethally precise, landing 13 of 15 shells on target and silencing an 88mm gun position that had been holding up the advance of Le Regiment de la Chaudière. 13 of 15, from a moving ship, at a concealed gun, under fire. That is not luck. That is a fire control problem solved under the worst conditions imaginable. A further naval fact ought to stop you cold, because it sits oddly against everything else here. Despite crewing landing craft that were being shredded on the beach obstacles, the Royal Canadian Navy is recorded as having suffered no fatal casualties on D-Day. The men they carried died, while the men who carried them, by this record, did not. A second irony hides inside the assignments, since Canadian minesweepers spent that morning clearing a lane not for the Canadians at Juno but for the Americans at Omaha. In the air, the Royal Canadian Air Force committed roughly 15 squadrons to the assault, and 22 RCAF airmen were killed on D-Day. Their part in the story binds up with the single greatest failure of the morning, the bombardment, which is where we go next. Here is a sentence you will hear in almost every popular account of D-Day, that the beaches were softened up by a massive air and naval bombardment before the troops went in. It sounds obviously true, and it is almost entirely useless, because at Juno the bombardment did not work, and the real story is not that it failed but the argument among historians over why it failed. Start with what actually happened. The aerial bombardment opened at around 23:30 on the night of June the 5th, when our AF Bomber Command began its work, and the tonnage was staggering, roughly 5,268 long tons of bombs dropped across more than 1,100 sorties, the largest weight of bombs Bomber Command had dropped to that point in the war. The result on the coastal defenses came to almost nothing, because the bombing left the defenses on Omaha, Gold, and Juno virtually intact, with cloud cover and timing dropping much of that enormous weight behind the beaches rather than on them. The naval guns followed from around 5:30. The World History Encyclopedia records that the roughly 90-minute naval bombardment destroyed less than 15% of the defenders' gun positions, because the casemates Rommel had insisted on, that 4-foot concrete, did their job. When the ramps dropped, the strong points at Berniers and Saint-Aubin and Courcelles were, in many cases, still firing. Now the disagreement, because this is where the channel earns its keep. Everyone agrees the bombardment failed, and nobody agrees on the reason, and the reasons are not interchangeable. The historian Chester Wilmot argued that the guns had in fact been accurately bombed and shelled and survived anyway, because they were so heavily protected by the concrete casemates Rommel had demanded, which in Wilmot's reading means the fire was good and the concrete was simply better. The official Canadian historian C.P. Stacey saw it the other way, arguing that the naval beach-drenching fire was inaccurate and of insufficient firepower, and that its effect was moral rather than material, frightening the defenders and driving them below ground for a few minutes without destroying them. The historian Terry Kopp pushed the accuracy point further still, documenting that the drenching fire from the 13th Field Regiment fell, on average, 200 yards past its targets, for the simple reason that reasonable accuracy could not be obtained from the pitching decks of landing craft. The platform was moving, and the fall of shot moved right along with it. Set against all three of those historians stands the commander on the spot. Major General Keller reported, after the fact, that the naval fire had been accurate and sustained, and the evidence and the weight of historical opinion contradict him. Keep that gap in mind, the gap between what the commander reported and what the record shows, because the question of Keller's judgment is going to come back. The historian Stephen Bourke has pressed a further point the popular story leaves out entirely, that the failure of the air bombardment, and the roughly 100 French civilians killed by bombs that missed, is a part of D-Day almost nobody discusses. Before the infantry, the plan called for tanks, and not ordinary tanks but swimming ones. The DD tank, the duplex drive, was a Sherman fitted with a canvas flotation screen and propellers, designed to launch from a landing craft offshore and swim to the beach under its own power, arriving with the first wave to give the infantry armored support against exactly the kind of strongpoints waiting at Juno. At Juno the DD tanks were crewed by the Canadian Armoured Regiments, the 1st Hussars and the Fort Garry Horse, rather than by British crews. And on the morning of June the 6th, in rough seas, 2 Canadian regiments looked at the same conditions and made 2 opposite decisions. This is one of the quietly fascinating moments of the day, because it amounts to a perfect natural experiment in decision-making under uncertainty. 2 teams, the same morning, the same choppy water, the same equipment, the same mission, and they hedged in opposite directions, exactly the way 2 analysts staring at the same volatile market will size their bets differently, one accepting more risk for the chance of a larger payoff, the other protecting the downside. There was no clean right answer in the moment, there was only the bet, and the outcome that would judge the bet afterward. The 1st Hussars chose to launch as planned, putting their swimming tanks into the water, some of them from thousands of yards out, and of roughly 29 DD tanks the first Hussars launched, around 21 reached the beach, while 7 or 8 sank, taking crews down with them. The Fort Garry Horse, supporting the 8th Brigade, studied the same water and made the other call, landing many of their tanks directly onto the beach rather than launching them into the swell, which meant their armor arrived after the infantry rather than alongside it. That timing mattered, and it mattered most cruelly to the men of the 8th Brigade, because in the Nan sector the Queen's Own Rifles assaulted the strongpoint at Berniers largely without the tank support that was supposed to be there in the first minutes. Hold the whole thing against Omaha. At Omaha, of roughly 29 DD tanks launched in the American sector, around 27 sank, 27 of 29, gone before they reached the sand. At Juno the bet the first Hussars made paid off by comparison, because most of their tanks lived, and the historian Chester Wilmot credited those DD tanks with the Canadian success in clearing the beach. The same gamble that drowned the armor at Omaha put armor on the sand at Juno. Same weapon, same morning, opposite result, and the difference came down to the water, the launch decision, and a margin of luck nobody could have priced in advance. At 7:45 in the Mike sector, the ramps came down at Courcelles. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles touched down at around 7:49 against the Courcelles strongpoints, the 88s and 75s in their thick casemates, much of which the bombardment had failed to touch. Courcelles was the strongest single position on the beach, which forced the Winnipegs and the Regina Rifles to take it largely by direct assault, bunker by bunker, with the surviving DD tanks of the 1st Hussars firing into casemate slits. One of those tank commanders, Leo Garipi of the 1st Hussars, ranked among the first tanks into Courcelles, knocked out an anti-tank bunker, and lived, and years later the town made him an honorary citizen of the place he had fought through. That detail says something the casualty figures cannot, because the towns remember the men by name. One of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, Francis Godin, later described the only tactic that worked in that killing zone. You couldn't stand still, Godin explained, because if you stood right there the machine guns were going to be after you, and so long as you kept moving, in his words, they were guessing. Keep moving and force the gunner to lead a moving target. Stand still and turn yourself into an easy solution to an easy problem. That was the entire science of survival in the first hour, compressed into one sentence by a man who lived it. The cost of taking Courcelles by direct assault went straight into the regimental ledgers. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles absorbed 128 casualties on D-Day, 57 of their men killed and another 71 wounded, in the accounting of the historian Mike Bechtold, while the Regina Rifles took 108. And one of the men who led through that morning, Major Lockhart Fulton of the Winnipegs, known as Lockie, earned the Distinguished Service Order for his actions on June the 6th and in the days that followed, clearing a minefield and taking the village of Grey-sur-Mer. The 7th Brigade paid full price. The worst single concentration of loss that morning, though, came not at Courcelles but 3 miles east, at a seawall in front of a town called Berniers. At 7:55 in the Nan sector, 10 minutes after Mike and 3 hours after the optimum tide, the 8th Brigade went in. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada landed at Berniers at around 8:12, and here every thread we have followed braids into a single catastrophe. The bombardment had failed to destroy the Berniers strongpoint, WN-28. The Fort Garry Horse had landed their tanks rather than swimming them in, so the armor was not yet there. And the Queen's Own Rifles assaulted that strongpoint, in C.P. Stacy's careful phrasing, captured without tank assistance, which means the infantry walked into it alone. The Queen's Own Rifles suffered the highest casualties of any Canadian unit on D-Day, 143 in total, and the historian Mike Bechtold gives the breakdown, 61 men killed and 82 wounded. The regiment's own history records that one company, landing directly in front of the strongpoint, took roughly 60 to 65 casualties in the first few minutes. Not the first hour, the first few minutes. A single company gutted before it cleared the sand, because the fire support that was supposed to be there had failed or had not yet arrived. One of the men who came off those ramps, Company Sergeant Major Charlie Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles, ranked among the very first ashore at Berniers, and he later wrote one of the most quoted accounts of any landing on any beach, in his memoir Battle Diary. As the landing craft moved away from the mother ship and closer to shore, Martin recalled, it came as a shock to realize the assault fleet was disappearing from view, and suddenly there was just them and an awful lot of ocean. Then the ramp came down, Heavy machine gun fire broke out from behind the seawall, and mortars dropped all over the beach. A word on Charlie Martin and his medals, because the two often blur together and they should not. Martin earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal for what he did following the Juno landing, and he would later also win the Military Medal, yet that second decoration came for an action at Hochwald, in Germany, on March 4, 1945, nearly a year later. The DCM belongs to Normandy. The Military Medal belongs to a different battle, on different ground, the following year. Down the beach at St. Aubin, the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment hit WN-27 and its 50mm gun in concrete, and the North Shore took 125 casualties, with their accompanying commander, Major Archie McNaughton, killed on D-Day. The armor that finally pried them loose came courtesy of Major Bill Bray of the Fort Garry Horse, who won the Distinguished Service Order for his determination to get the Canadians ashore that day, leading his squadron through a minefield under fire. On the far eastern flank, the British No. 48 Royal Marine Commando came ashore at St. Aubin with the job of pushing east to link up with the troops from Sword, and they took roughly 50% casualties before being stopped cold at a strongpoint at Langrune. They did not close the gap that day, and that open gap on the eastern flank would matter within hours. By mid-morning, against everything the first hour had thrown at them, the Canadians were off the beach and moving inland, and now the paradox at the center of this story begins to take physical shape on the map. Berniers fell largely clear by around 9 o'clock, and with the Courcelles guns finally silenced, including the 88 that HMCS Algonquin had helped knock out, Le Regiment de la Chaudière pushed past the Queen's Own Rifles and drove inland. Around 10:50 the Reserve 9th Brigade got the order to land, and at 11:40 its landing craft touched down at Nan White into a beach so congested with men and vehicles that movement nearly seized up altogether. Then the Canadians did the thing the whole story has been building toward. The forward elements pushed deeper into France than any other Allied force on D-Day. The lead tanks of the 1st Hussars Squadron reached the Canbayou Road near Bretteville-Lorguilius before pulling back for lack of infantry to hold the ground, and the Queen's Own Rifles, the same regiment gutted at Berniers at dawn, reached the village of Annecy, roughly 13.5 kilometers inland, becoming the only Canadian battalion to reach its final assigned objective for the day. In the afternoon, the 7th Brigade linked up with the British 50th Division pushing inland from Gold Beach, at Crully, sealing the western seam of the invasion front exactly as the plan required, so that Juno and Gold now ran as one continuous line. The deepest objectives, though, went untaken. The airfield at Carpiquet, west of Cannes, lay out of reach. The Canbayou Railway stayed uncut. And on the eastern flank the gap toward Sword, the one the Royal Marine Commandos had failed to close, still gaped open, and that open gap was about to be tested. In the afternoon the German 21st Panzer Division counterattacked straight into the seam between Juno and Sword, and a spearhead actually reached the coast near Luc-sur-Mer, so that for a few hours the invasion front carried a German wedge driven into it. The 21st Panzer could not widen the wedge, could not split the beachhead, and pulled back. The line held. By nightfall, the men of Juno had dug in deeper into France than any other division, short of their farthest objectives yet deeper than anyone, at a cost the official history records as 340 Canadians killed, 574 wounded, and 47 taken prisoner. Those numbers deserve a passage of their own, because they are nowhere near as simple as they look. If you have ever worked with data, you know that a number means nothing until you know exactly what it counts. A company reporting its active users can produce 3 completely different and completely honest figures depending on whether active means daily, monthly, or ever logged in, and the number is not lying, the definition is doing the work. The casualty figures for Juno Beach are exactly this kind of problem, and the channel's accuracy depends on getting the definition right every single time. Here is the authoritative baseline. The official Canadian historian C.P. Stacey, in the Victory Campaign, gives the Seaborne 3 RD Division's losses on D-Day as 340 killed or died of wounds, 574 wounded, and 47 taken prisoner, and Stacey himself cautioned that it was not possible to cleanly separate the casualties suffered on the beaches from those suffered in the later stages of the day. That yields a Juno Sector Canadian Army total of 961. Watch what happens as the definition shifts. Add the 243 British Army casualties suffered in the Juno Sector, and the combined beach figure climbs toward roughly 1,200, the number Britannica cites, framing it as 1,200 casualties out of 21,400 troops, a ratio of 1 in 18. Shift the definition again. The figure of 359 Canadians killed on D-Day, which surfaces in many accounts, is the 340 killed in the Juno sector plus 19 Canadian paratroopers killed inland with the airborne. Add the 22 RCAF airmen killed, and the Juno Beach Center lands on 381 Canadian soldiers and airmen killed on June the 6th, with over 584 wounded and 131 captured. And Stacey's figure for the entire Canadian Army's share of D-Day, paratroopers, inland fighting, everything, comes to 1,074. There is no single real number of Canadian dead on D-Day. The 340, the 359, the 381, they are all real, and they all count different things. The 340 is the Juno sector, seaborne, Canadian Army. The 359 adds the paratroopers. The 381 adds the airmen. The 1,074 is the whole Canadian Army share. The 1,200 folds in the British in the sector. The number is never wrong, the scope is the thing you have to state out loud, and the popular accounts almost never do. That is not a footnote. On a beach this contested, the definition is the history. For comparison, set Juno's roughly 1,200 beach casualties against the other beaches. Omaha stood in a category of its own, with the most conservative figure cited by the historian Harrison at about 2,000, and over 2,000 American casualties widely reported. Gold cost the British 50th Division on the order of 413 on the beaches. Utah came in lightest, around 197. Juno landed second deadliest of the 5 assault beaches, second only to Omaha, the same ranking, exactly, as the resistance it faced. For all the loss on the beach, the men the Canadians fought through on June the 6th were largely the static defenders of the 716th Division. Older men, Eastern conscripts, second-line troops behind concrete. On June the 7th the enemy changed, and it changed into something far worse. The Canadians' principal opponent in the days after the landing was the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division, and the name was literal. Its rank and file were teenagers, many 16, 17, 18 years old, raised under the regime from childhood, yet its officers and senior NCOS were no boys at all, they were battle-hardened veterans drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division, men who had fought on the Eastern Front and carried its methods west with them. A division of fanatical children, led by experienced killers. That combination is the engine of the worst thing in this story. One officer above all defined the 12th SS in front of the Canadians, Kurt Meyer, who commanded the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Meyer already stood as a legend within the SS, aggressive, charismatic, contemptuous, and by his own later account he dismissed the men coming at him, reportedly boasting before the counterattack that he would throw those little Canadian fishes back into the sea. Hold the contempt inside that sentence, because within 48 hours it curdled into something criminal. On June the 7th, the day after the landing, the Canadian 9th Brigade pushed inland toward Carpiquet, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, advancing through the villages of Buron and Authie, and Kurt Meyer was watching them. From the tower of an old monastery called the Abbaye d'Ardenne, which he had turned into his command post, Meyer could see the Canadian advance laid out below him, and he sprang in ambush. The fighting at Authie turned vicious, with the Sherbrooke Fusiliers losing more than 25 Shermans, and the 12th SS retook Authie and the hamlet of Franqueville and shoved the Canadians back roughly 2 miles to Buron. Around 84 Allied soldiers were killed at Authie that day, along with several French civilians. The 12th SS had stopped the Canadian drive on Carpiquet. What happened at the Abbaye d'Ardenne that same night, though, was not a battle. It was murder. This is the part of the Juno story the popular memory leaves out almost entirely, and it is the part that matters most. In the days following D-Day, members of the 12th SS Panzer Division murdered Canadian prisoners of war, not killed in the chaos of an assault but murdered, after capture, in cold blood, behind the lines, and the central site was Kurt Meyer's own command post, the Abbaye d'Ardenne. The arithmetic of that one place is precise and terrible. 20 Canadians were murdered at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, 11 of them on the night of June the 7th, men of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, the Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders, and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, 7 more on June the 8th, all of them North Nova Scotia Highlanders, and 2 more, on or near June 17, Lieutenant Fred Williams and Lance Corporal George Pollard. The victims were shot in the back of the head. Some were bludgeoned. The memorial that now stands in the garden of the Abbaye, unveiled on the 40th anniversary in 1984, records it without flinching, stating that on the night of the 7th and 8th of June 1944, 18 Canadian soldiers were murdered in that garden while being held as prisoners of war, and 2 more died there or nearby on the 17th of June. The Abbaye was not the only site. At the Château d'Audru, 19 prisoners were murdered on June 8 under an SS officer named Gerhard Bremer. There were murders at Pietertenbesen. There were killings ordered by another SS commander, Wilhelm Mohnke. When the war crimes investigators added it all up across the Normandy campaign, the total ran staggering, because up to 156 Canadian soldiers were illegally murdered, in the words quoted by Veterans Affairs Canada, in scattered groups, in various pockets of the Normandy countryside. The historian Howard Margolian, a former war crimes investigator with Canada's Department of Justice, documented more than 150 Canadian prisoners killed by the 12th SS in his study Conduct Unbecoming. And here is the figure that should never be allowed to fade. 1 in 6 Canadians killed in Normandy died after capture, after surrender, after they had given up the fight. That ratio, recorded by the historians Lachenborg and Madsen, ran far higher than the Allies experienced against any other German formation in Normandy. The 12th SS did not just fight the Canadians harder. It executed them more. Now we have to confront a claim that always surfaces whenever the Abbaye comes up, because confronting it is exactly what this channel exists to do. The claim runs like this: that war is hell, both sides did terrible things, Allied soldiers killed surrendering Germans too, so who are we to single out the 12th SS? It is a comfortable argument, and on the specific facts it is wrong, and the historian who dismantles it is no apologist for his own side. Terry Kopp, one of the most respected historians of the Canadians in Normandy, takes the question head-on. There is no doubt, Kopp acknowledges, that Allied soldiers did this too, that men on both sides, in the heat and terror of an assault, killed enemies who were in the very act of surrendering, and Kopp does not pretend otherwise. The point about the atrocities by the 12th SS, in Kopp's telling, is that these were executions that occurred long after the battle was over. That distinction is the one the comfortable argument erases, and it is the whole point. Killing a man in the chaos of an assault, in the half-second when surrender and ambush look identical down a rifle sight, is a tragedy of combat. Marching prisoners to a garden behind your headquarters days after their capture and shooting them in the back of the head is something else entirely. It is policy. It is murder with the paperwork still pending. The false equivalence between the two is not balance, it is an evasion, and naming it as an evasion is the more honest position, the one the evidence actually supports. So the men of the 12th SS murdered up to 156 Canadian prisoners, which raises the obvious question a court eventually had to answer, namely who was responsible, and what happened to him. The answer is the most uncomfortable thing in this entire story. Kurt Meyer survived the war. After the death of the division's commander Fritz Wood on June 14, Meyer took command of the entire 12th SS, becoming, at 33, the youngest divisional commander of the war. He fought on, and Belgian partisans finally captured him on September 6, 1944. What followed was Canada's first major war crimes trial, and one of the most important in the legal history of the 20th century. In December 1945, in the occupied German town of Aurich, Kurt Meyer stood trial before a Canadian military court, with Lieutenant Colonel Bruce MacDonald prosecuting. The charges, 5 in all, centered on 2 ideas: that Meyer had incited his troops to deny quarter, to take no prisoners, and that, as their commander, he bore responsibility for the murders his men carried out at the Abbaye d'Ardennes. A key prosecution witness, Jan Giesianek, testified to what he had heard at Meyer's headquarters. By Giesianek's account, Meyer had asked, of 7 prisoners, what they should do with them, since they only ate up the unit's rations, and had then issued the instruction that in future no more prisoners were to be taken. Treat that as testimony, as what a witness swore he heard, rather than as a verified word-for-word quote, and the court found it credible. The Meyer trial mattered far beyond Meyer, because it stood among the very first applications of a doctrine that now sits at the foundation of modern law: command responsibility. The principle is simple and radical. A commander can be held legally accountable for the crimes his subordinates commit, even crimes he did not personally carry out, because accountability flows up the chain, not only down it. It is the same logic that underpins how liability works inside any large organization today. The idea that the person who sets the conditions, gives the orders, and creates the climate cannot hide behind the hands that did the act. The Meyer trial ran concurrently with the more famous Yamashita case in the Pacific, and together they helped establish a principle of accountability that outlived the war by generations. Meyer was convicted on 3 of the 5 charges, inciting his men to murder, and bearing command responsibility for the Abe killings, and acquitted on 2. On December 28, 1945, the court sentenced Kurt Meyer to death. The death sentence was never carried out, and the story of how it was not carried out is the part that, 80 years later, still has the power to make Canadians angry. On January 14, 1946, barely 2 weeks after the sentence, the convening authority, Major General Chris Vokes, commuted Kurt Meyer's death sentence to life imprisonment, reasoning that he did not feel Meyer's degree of personal responsibility warranted execution. The men convicted of command responsibility for the murder of Canadian prisoners would not hang, and the decision sparked public outrage in Canada. It did not stop there. Meyer served roughly 5 years at Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick, on Canadian soil, the same soil that had raised many of the men his division murdered, before being transferred in 1951 to a British military prison at Wörl, in West Germany. On September 7, 1954, 10 years after the murders, Kurt Meyer was released, his sentence reduced to 14 years, and walked free. The reasons had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with Cold War politics. By the early 1950s, the West was rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, rearming it, drawing it toward NATO, and the political climate that had wanted SS war criminals hanged in 1945 had shifted to one that found their continued imprisonment inconvenient. Meyer walked out into that new world, and he did not walk out quietly, becoming a leading spokesman for the organization of Waffen-SS veterans and devoting himself to the argument that the Waffen-SS had been simple soldiers, apolitical men who had merely fought, a portrayal historians have since thoroughly dismantled. Kurt Meyer died on December 23, 1961, in the German town of Hagen. That date matters, because at least one source records it wrongly as 1951, a decade too early, confusing it with another date entirely. Meyer died in 1961, a free man, 7 years after his release, an advocate to the end for the reputation of the division that had executed Canadian prisoners in a garden in Normandy. The men he was convicted over had lain dead since June 1944, buried at the Canadian War Cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer, and he outlived them by 17 years, spending the last of those years insisting his side had done nothing wrong. One more contested figure deserves weighing, and this one cuts closer to home, because he was the Canadian commander himself. Major General Rodney Keller commanded the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division at Juno, and by the standards of the day he carried himself as an exemplary fighting soldier's general, born in Tetbury, England, in 1900, raised in Kelowna, British Columbia, a graduate of the Royal Military College in 1920, a Princess Patricia's officer. When the 3rd Division came to him in 1942, Keller stood as the youngest Canadian divisional commander. His troops liked him, and there is a real argument that the men who landed at Juno did so under a commander they trusted. The popular image of the beloved divisional commander does not survive contact with the records of the men above and around him, and honesty requires putting both pictures on the table at once. Keller's own quartermaster, Ernest Coty, described chronic indecisiveness in his commander on D-Day itself, and more damning still, Keller's immediate superiors in the British Corps and Army he served under considered him unfit to command the division. A drinking problem and a record of security breaches before D-Day had eroded his standing among superiors and staff alike. By August he was reportedly shell-shy, and a cruel barracks rhyme circulated through the ranks, that Keller was Yeller. What saved him, oddly, was loyalty from the very top and then a German bomb dropped by Americans. 2 of the most respected Canadian commanders of the war, Guy Simonds and Harry Crerar, both admired Keller and refused to relieve him, with Simonds arguing that the individual qualities of General Keller were unimportant in comparison with the bigger problem of maintaining morale, that the cost of removing him publicly outweighed the cost of keeping him. So Keller stayed, handled a later operation poorly, and then, on August 8, 1944, during a major offensive, American bombers accidentally carpet-bombed his own headquarters. Keller was wounded, and he never held active command again. The real Keller is impossible to pin down. The soldiers general his men trusted on the beach, and the indecisive commander his superiors judged unfit and would likely have removed had a friendly bomb not removed him first, are both documented, and both are true. Rodney Keller retired in 1953 and died on June 21, 1954, of a heart attack, in Normandy, where he had returned for the 10th anniversary of the landing he had commanded. He went back to the beach. The beach is where his heart gave out. History has never fully decided what to make of him, and this story will not pretend to settle it. There is a detail about Juno that surprises almost everyone, and it speaks directly to the question of why the beach faded. No Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the Commonwealth, was awarded for Juno Beach, and in fact no Victoria Cross went to any Canadian for anything on D-Day. The only Victoria Cross awarded anywhere on June 6 went to a British soldier, Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards, at Gold Beach, and the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian in the entire Normandy campaign came more than 2 months later, to Major David Curry of the South Alberta Regiment, for the fighting at St. Lambert-sur-Dives between August 18 and 20, 1944. That does not mean the valor at Juno went unrecognized. The Queen's Own Rifles Major Charles Dalton won the Distinguished Service Order at the Bernier Strongpoint, Major Lockhart Fulton of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles won the DSO, Major Bill Bray of the Fort Garry Horse won the DSO for getting the armor ashore, and Charlie Martin earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The dedicated reference work on these awards, T. Robert Fowler's Valor on Juno Beach, catalogues them. The absence of a single Victoria Cross, though, the absence of the one decoration that fixes a battle in the public imagination forever, is part of why Juno fades, because there was no single sanctioned legendary act for the popular memory to build a monument around. There was just a whole division, doing the job, and bleeding for it. And that is the bridge to the central argument of this entire story, because the reason Juno is forgotten is not the reason most people assume. Here is the claim this whole episode has been circling, and here is the evidence for it. Juno is not forgotten because it was small, and it is not forgotten because it was easy. Juno is forgotten, in large part, precisely because it succeeded. Consider how memory actually works. The popular imagination of D-Day gravitates to Omaha, and it gravitates there for an understandable reason, because Omaha was a near disaster, a slaughter in the surf, the bloodiest beach, the closest the invasion came to failure. Drama lives in catastrophe. The narrative gravity of June 6 pulls, irresistibly, toward the beach where the most went wrong. Juno, by contrast, ranked among the most successful landings of the day, with the Canadians taking the second stiffest resistance and pushing the deepest inland, and success plays out less cinematic than catastrophe. The beach that achieved the most offered the popular story the least to grip onto. Some scholars have made this case directly, arguing that Juno, alongside Utah, ranks among the most strategically successful of the 5 landings, and that this very success has lowered its dramatic profile rather than raising its fame. The Warfare History Network has noted plainly how much less has been written about the Canadian beachhead. A quieter piece of evidence comes from visitors to the Normandy coast, who observe that at Utah and Omaha the flags are American, at Gold the Union Jack, but at Juno it is the Canadian maple leaf, because there, the people remember. The local memory stays intact. It is the global, Anglo-American narrative that overshadows it. Honesty requires a correction to the forgotten framing itself, because this channel does not deal in easy slogans. Juno is not literally unknown. Canada commemorates it at the highest levels, officially and fully. The more precise and defensible claim runs like this, that Juno is overshadowed in the popular Anglo-American narrative of D-Day, not erased but eclipsed, and the eclipse has a specific cause, the gravitational pull of Omaha's catastrophe, the absence of a single legendary Victoria Cross moment, and the plain, unglamorous truth that doing the job well is harder to mythologize than nearly dying in the attempt. Even Veterans Affairs Canada concedes the point in its own framing, admitting that Canadians often seem all too ready to forget. The forgotten beach is forgotten not for failing but for the least dramatic of all reasons, because it worked. The fighting did not end when the sun went down on June 6, and the deepest objectives the Canadians had been given that day took weeks of grinding, costly battle to actually reach. The airfield at Carpiquet, a D-Day objective, did not fall until July the 4th, in an operation the Canadians codenamed Windsor, and the city of Cannes beyond it stayed uncleared for weeks, with a major offensive in early July taking the northern half of the city. The villages where the 12th SS had ambushed the Canadians on June the 7th, Buran and Authie, were not retaken until July the 8th, and when the Canadians finally took Buran back that day, the Highland Light Infantry of Canada lost 262 men in a single day. One village. One day. More than double the casualties of any regiment on the beach itself. That is the part the beach narrative always cuts off. The landing opened a campaign, it did not end one, and the campaign ran bloodier than the landing. The Regina Rifles held the village of Bretteville-Lord-Wilius against 12th SS armor on the night of June the 8th into the 9th, with Lieutenant Colonel Matheson personally directing the defense and roughly 5 German tanks knocked out in the streets. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles were counterattacked and partly overrun at Puteaux and Besson on June the 8th, and some of the Winnipegs taken prisoner there were among the murdered. The beach was the easy part, measured against what came after. Among the men who came ashore at Juno and lived through all of it was a young artillery officer named Garth Webb, of the 14th Field Regiment, who had landed at Berniers with a self-propelled gun. Webb survived the war, and nearly 50 years later he became the man who refused to let Juno stay forgotten. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Canadian veterans returned to the Normandy coast and found something missing, because little there acknowledged what Canada had done on that beach. The flags, the markers, the museum spoke of the Americans and the British, and of the 14,000 Canadians who had landed at Juno. The physical memory on the ground ran thin. Garth Webb, the artillery officer who had landed at Berniers, set out to change that, and together with his partner Lise Cooper he launched a grassroots campaign to build a Canadian museum on the beach, a campaign that ultimately raised on the order of $10 million and more, drawing on ordinary Canadians, the federal and provincial governments, and French support. The town of Courseulles-sur-Mer provided the land, about 1.5 hectares of it, on the beach the Canadians had taken. The Juno Beach Center opened on June 6, 2003, 59 years to the day after the landing, with more than 1,000 veterans attending. It remains the only museum in France devoted to Canada's full role in the Second World War, and it commemorates the 381 Canadians who died on D-Day and the roughly 5,500 Canadians killed in the wider Battle of Normandy. Garth Webb lived to see it stand, and died on May 8, 2012. Since opening, the center has welcomed more than 1.5 million visitors, around 100,000 in 2024 alone, roughly a third of them Canadian. The fight to remember Juno was not over even then. Between 2020 and 2022, a French developer proposed building condominiums on the land immediately beside the center, on the very ground the Canadians had fought across, and a campaign rose up under the banner Save Juno Beach, with tens of thousands of letters following. In October 2022, the Canadian and French governments and local authorities secured the land for long-term protection under a 99-year arrangement, with the legal fees alone reportedly exceeding $800,000. 80 years after the landing, Canadians were still spending money and effort to keep the memory of Juno from being paved over. The beach that succeeded too quietly to be famous still had to be defended in court. On June 6, 2024, the 80th anniversary, the Canadian national ceremony unfolded at the Juno Beach Center at Courseulles-sur-Mer, with Canadian and French heads of government attending alongside a senior member of the British royal family. At the center of it, where they belonged, sat a delegation of 13 surviving Canadian veterans of the Second World War, aged between 98 and 104 years old. Think about those ages for a moment. The youngest man in that delegation had been a teenager when he came ashore, roughly the same age as the boys of the Hitlerjugend waiting on the other side of the wire. The window in which any of these men can still tell their own story in their own voice is closing, and everyone at that ceremony in 2024 understood it. The center renewed a permanent exhibition for the anniversary, telling the story of who Canada was then and is now, and there are plans for a memorial park on the adjacent land, the same land that nearly became condominiums. The ground itself still holds the shape of June 6. The terrain and many of the seafront buildings remain recognizable from 1944, and preserved German resistance nests still squat above the sand. At Berniers stands the house the Queen's own rifles reached at first light, claimed by many as the first house on French soil liberated by seaborne Allied forces, known now as Canada House. A duplex drive Sherman, one of the swimming tanks, stands as a memorial at Courseulles. Near the center sits an armored engineering vehicle called 1 Charlie, which came ashore on Mike Red on D-Day and lost 4 of its 6 crew. Recovered and preserved, it sits there now, on the beach where 4 of its 6 men died, as quiet and as permanent as the argument over how much of this Canada chose to remember. One last artifact deserves a place in the telling, because it captures the whole paradox in a single object. A Canadian Army cameraman, Sergeant Bill Grant of the Film and Photo Unit, came ashore at Juno with the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment, into WN-27, the 50mm gun, the strong point that cost the North Shore 125 men, and Bill Grant kept filming. The footage he shot from the landing craft, as the assault went in, is the only known surviving film of a D-Day assault captured from the perspective of the landing craft itself, the view from inside the trap, looking out at the beach. That footage carried such weight that it was screened for the highest levels of Allied command, for the Supreme Allied Commander and for Britain's wartime leadership. The most powerful men prosecuting the war watched the Canadian assault on Juno through the lens of a sergeant who had carried a camera into the fire on the New Brunswick Regiment's ramp. They saw Juno, and in that screening room they understood exactly what the Canadians had done. Then, in the long telling of the war that followed, that clarity faded. The footage exists. The men were decorated. The towns still fly the maple leaf. The center stands, the bunkers stand, the swimming tank stands. Everything needed to remember Juno sits physically present on that beach and in that film. What faded was not the evidence. What faded was the attention. So this was Juno. 14,000 Canadians, on a 6-mile beach between 2 British ones, into the second stiffest resistance of D-Day, landing late on a turning tide that drowned a third of their landing craft on obstacles they could not see. They lost 340 of their own in that sector by the official count, or 359, or 381, or more, depending on what you decide to count. The Queen's Own Rifles lost a company in minutes at Berniers and reached the deepest objective of any battalion in the invasion by nightfall. They pushed farther inland than any other Allied force on the continent, and almost no one outside Canada tells the story. The men who murdered their prisoners faced a Canadian court, and their commander was sentenced to death, and that sentence was commuted within 2 weeks, and that man walked free in 1954 and died old in his bed in 1961, defending the honor of the division that had shot Canadians in the back of the head in a monastery garden. The general who led the landing was beloved by his men and judged unfit by his superiors, and history has never resolved which verdict was right, and he died of a heart attack on the beach he had taken, 10 years to the season after he took it. The numbers do not agree with each other. The story does not resolve. Juno does not offer the clean catharsis of Omaha, and it never will, and that is the precise reason it stays at the edge of memory while the bloodier beach sits at the center of it. The maple leaf still flies over Courseulles because the people there remember. The bunkers still stand. The swimming tank still sits on the sand. And 1 in 6 Canadians killed in Normandy died after they had already surrendered. Those are the facts of Juno Beach. They do not tie into a bow. The beach that did the most is remembered the least. The war criminal outlived his victims by 17 years, and the only people who never forgot are the ones who were actually there, and there are 13 of them left, and soon there will be none.